What if I told you that nesting die sets can do way more than just cut layers and shapes? In this video, you'll learn 6 different ways to stretch one set of dies beyond the basics and create beautiful gatefold card bases, layered frames, and even shaker windows. Plus, it's the perfect way to use up those little pattern paper scraps that keep piling up and taking over our craft rooms. Honestly, it's one of those sets that looks simple at first, but once you see these techniques, you'll realize just how versatile it really is, especially with the tips I'll share along the way. And the best part is you'll walk away with ideas you can use right away to get more out of the dies you already own. Let's dive in. I love creating fun fold cards, but to be honest, I find calculating card dimensions very challenging. So when I saw these Coca Rosa dies, I felt like these would solve my problem in a big way because these dies cut and score at the same time. So it's really quick and hassle-free. By the way, I also received a cute free gift that looks like bunnies and buckets, but I'll set that aside for now. I think it'll be great for Easter cards. These dies gave me so many different ideas. I decided to focus on just one of these sets in today's video, otherwise we'd be here for hours. I've already used this die set for a trial run. The pieces come attached but are really easy to separate since the metal isn't too tough, and you can just pull them apart without much effort. I'll use this die set to create 2 different gatefold cards, one shaker card, a shaped edge card, plus a couple of gift tags with lots of tips and tricks. But please know that you can use practically any die in your stash for these techniques. I picked scraps of pattern paper and card bases I'll need for my first couple of cards, so let's get started. For the first card, I'm only going to cut one edge because I don't want the full gatefold effect this time, just the shaped edge on one side. I'll use one of these dies. Actually, there are 2 in this set, and they're meant for creating gatefold cards. Let me bring in my die catcher here so I don't lose anything. Now, I'll line this up with the grid on my magnetic glass mat to find the center. Since this is an E2 card, the long edge measures 5.5 inches, therefore the center point is at 2 3/4 inches. I want to make sure the die is straight, and once I have that, I'll tape it down securely and run it through my die cutting machine. Since this die set is meant to create a gatefold, unfortunately the stitch detail along the outline would get trimmed away when I detach the extra piece to create the shaped edge, but it doesn't bother me as much. I'll now need to cut through these 2 attached edges to finish the border. For that, you can use a pair of scissors, but honestly, I'm not the best with scissors, so what I'm going to do instead is use my Fiskars trimmer since it has a wire guide, which I find easier to use when I'm making partial cuts. It's easy to line up because you can see the cut right on the track. Let me hold it up close. You can see the wire is exactly where the cut is going to happen. So I'll slide this down very carefully right up to the cut mark, and I can actually feel it as it hits the part where the curve starts. Now, I do see a little bit of a frayed edge here, but that can be easily fixed with a pair of scissors, and I'll show you in a couple of minutes how I'll disguise any unevenness along the edge. I'll do the same on the other side, just line it up with the track. Now I'll bring the blade right down until I can feel that cut, and there, it's come right off. Again, I'll just take my scissors and tidy up the edge a little bit just to finish it off. Here's a tip for disguising uneven edges. One is to add an embossed line. I have some washi tape lined up on my scoreboard here to act as a guide. By the way, I demoed the hack for this in a recent hacks video, so make sure you check it out after if you're curious. I'll leave a link to it in the video description. I'll butt the edge of my card up against that tape, slide the card down a little bit so I can get the scoring tool into the notch at the top, then take the groove closest to the tape and score along it. You want to score from the back so the groove embosses outward. That way it hides the uneven edge and also adds a nice design element. Another option is to add a narrow strip of paper like gold foil or another coordinating color right over the edge. That will completely cover any imperfections, and it's that easy. I still see a bit of unevenness, so I'll clean up the edge again and repeat the scoring once more. Now that I've cleaned up and embossed that line, you can see how neat that looks. Once I add the layered centerpiece, the embossed line across the middle won't show and it'll look more finished. Let's move on to the next step. I'll give this card a nice burnish so it lies flat. First, I'll add a piece of this pattern paper inside the card, just the section behind the flap. So let me cut it down to size and adhere it. Now for the centerpiece. I'll use the floral paper as the base layer, and the only way to cover the centerpiece completely is by using the two edge dies together and then shaping it after. This paper is directional. It's going underneath another layer and won't be very visible. But you'll see I'll have to reorient the card into a horizontal design later because of how I stamped the sentiment. Since I used two separate dies to create the base layer, you can see the pieces attached here. But don't worry, there's an easy fix for that. I'll snip the strips off to match the design on the other two sides. You can see this side has a bit of a protrusion. I want to recreate that on the other two sides. It doesn't need to be perfect, but I want it to roughly match the layers that I'll add on top. I'll cut the strip at an angle from both sides so it mimics the peak on the other side. It's not exact, but it works pretty well, I think. Now you can see that the design is uniform. One created by the die and the other one just cut manually. Let me adhere the piece before proceeding to the next step. Next, I'll use these two dies to create more layers for the centerpiece. I have a ton of vellum scraps, by the way. I keep them in this folder I made with my laminator. If you haven't seen that video yet, I'll link it in the video description as well. I showed 11 laminator hacks and how to create this folder in multiple ways, and it's a great way to store scraps and bits and bobs left over from your projects. I'll grab a scrap of lightweight vellum to create the middle layer, but let me first create the sentiment layer as well so I can cut everything out together. I'll use my paper tray ink stamps for this since they are the perfect size for this smaller die. I'll be heat embossing the sentiment, and in an effort to fit the die to the scrap piece of cardstock I'm using here, I ended up stamping the sentiment in the wrong orientation, which I'll realize in just a bit. Anyway, let's continue. I need to ensure the stamp is centered since it doesn't leave much space around the edges. I'm using silver embossing powder from Gina K Designs, and I'll tap off any excess. I see some stray specks of embossing powder, so I'll use a brush to flick them off and then heat set the sentiment. I'll center the smaller die around the sentiment and cut out both layers, and I'll be right back. I'll adhere the sentiment layer to the vellum after ensuring the orientation is correct, since this isn't a perfect square. Now I'll layer this over the centerpiece, but this looks wrong. I wasn't getting the correct orientation at first, so it should actually be positioned this way. Instead of being a vertical card, I can rotate the card base and make it horizontal. It's that easy. Thankfully, everything worked out perfectly in the end. I'll use some foam tape to give it some dimension and secure it. I added these dollar store embellishments in two sizes to finish the card. Here's the finished card. I can call it a clean and simple card if I discount the part where I created the edge and cleaning it up a little, which added a few extra steps. But otherwise, it was straightforward. But what's really great is that you can use a die set in a surprisingly versatile way and extend its use to get more bang out of your buck. By the way, this video is part of my new Maximize Your Craft Supplies series, where I'll show you how to take one or two supplies and get a lot more out of them, so you don't feel like you need to buy every new thing in the market. You'll find that playlist on my channel, and I'll link to it in my video description as well. I'm using a cardstock panel which is textured on one side and the other is smoother, and I'll use the textured side on top. This die set is meant for a square 4 1/4 by 4 1/4 inch card, but I've cut my panel at 8.5 by 4.5 inches to create the gatefold for a couple of reasons. When I use the two dies together, they may not line up perfectly. Plus, there's some glue on the edge here, so I'll have a little buffer to trim that side down after die cutting. I'll start with scoring the panel at 2 1/8 inches, and it's very conveniently indicated here on the scale. I'll score it, flip the cardstock around, and score again at 2 1/8 inches on the other side. Now I can fold it to create a gatefold card. For the inside layer, I'm using another scrap piece of this floral paper. I find it looks striking against the black, and I'll use the other piece on the outside. The reverse side is great since it has black in the design, but I think I prefer the stark contrast with the black with this side. This scrap has a frayed edge, which I'll clean later, but first I'll mark where I need to cut, keeping the cuts just inside the fold lines so the card closes properly. I'll cut the paper down to size and trim the frayed edges. Just checking to see if the folds close nicely. But I won't stick it down just yet because I first need to trim down the top of the card base to remove the glue. And then I can center the pattern paper perfectly. Now I'll create the layers for the card front. I'll use a pencil to mark off how much I need, and since I need 2 pieces for the 2 gatefold flaps, I'll hold 2 pieces together and slice them. Now I'll die cut the panels and then the card base. As before, I'll use my scissors to detach the inside pieces. They're a little bit wider than I need them to be, but I'll trim off the excess later. Now time to create the gatefold on the card base. Remember, I have to trim down the edge with the glue, so I'll take my time to line up the dies with the bottom of the card base and the edge of the flap. Once they're aligned, I'll secure them with washi tape, open up the folds because I don't want the dies to cut through the complete card base, and I'll run it through my die cutting machine. Remember, the card needs to be 4 1/4 by 4 1/4 inches. I initially cut it slightly larger at 4.5 inches, so now I'll trim it down to the correct size. Once that's down, I'll burnish the folds really well. Time to adhere the top layer with some liquid glue. I need the wiggle time because the curved edge needs to match up perfectly. Next, I'll need to trim the overhanging edges. Again, you can use a pair of scissors for this, but I prefer to use my trimmer since it'll give me really straight lines. Here's another tip. When trimming, make sure the cutting blade only catches the overhang. You'll feel where the blade lands as you bring it down. Make sure you aren't applying any pressure at this point. If you feel resistance, you know the card base is in the way. So just move the edge in a tiny bit and try again until you feel the blade go down smoothly. So here I'm feeling an obstruction, so I'll move the panel over ever so slightly to the left away from the edge of the trimmer and try again. And this time I feel no obstruction and it cuts through like butter. When trimming the fold area, I'm careful not to cut through the card base to avoid any damage. For the smaller overhangs or minor misalignments, I'll just use my scissors to neaten those up. I see this edge is a little uneven, so I'll just take off a sliver from the edge, and now the card front looks nice and straight. Now it's time to place the inside layer. I'll center it carefully, and this will be the base for the centerpiece. I'm using the scrap piece from the card front as a mat. I'll line it up with the card opening and use my magnet to hold it down, and then apply a little bit of glue so it doesn't shift, and then I can secure it fully. I don't need to worry about the tiny gap in the middle because the label will cover it up. I'll trim the tiny tails from this to neaten it up. I'm using this floral layer again for the second layer, and I've created another sentiment layer by heat embossing the same sentiment as the last one. I'll apply foam tape to both the layers to disguise any imperfection in the base layer. I'll apply a little glue on the foam tape so I have a few seconds to wiggle and slide it into place. And there we go. Now we have a perfect card, but because the card base is black, there's no way to write a message. So I'll attach a piece of white cardstock at the back. Here's how I finish the card. Since the card is a little thick, the flaps tend to lift, so I tied a ribbon around it. I really like how the black and white tie together with the ribbon. I also added silver pearls and, of course, the white cardstock on the back for writing a message. I can stamp Handmade by here, and it's ready. The card may open slightly because of the thickness, but tying the ribbon will keep it closed perfectly. The sentiment is visible and the card is secure. I like to use my reverse tweezers as a third hand to hold the ribbon while I tie it. The sentiment is visible and the card is secure. The next technique will show you how you can create a similar card that requires fewer steps, and also how to add more visual interest to your cards. So please keep watching. For this card, I'm using an older paper pad by Uniquely Creative. I'll link to it in the list of supplies if it's still available. I'll create a similar design to the last one, but this technique will be much easier since I'll let the double-sided pattern do the heavy lifting for me. One thing I want to mention is that when using double-sided pattern paper, I try to pick something that isn't too bold or fussy. A busy pattern can distract from the sentiment and overall design, so I'm choosing a muted neutral design. The design inside is a little busy, but the color is really soft, and also the centerpiece will cover a lot of the real estate inside, so this works well. The other side is beautiful and will go on the outside, but I'll also enhance it a bit, and I'll get to that in just a minute. I'll continue using the same sentiment set I've been using because it fits the label perfectly. I'll cut a piece from the sheet and keep some of the beautiful distressed and stamped background in, and since I need an 8.5 by 4.5 inch piece, I'll cut it to retain some of that. Not sure if you can tell on camera, but the paper is directional but very subtle, so I don't have to be that mindful about how I cut it. So I changed my mind about including the stamped parts because most of it will get covered up by the card panel on the back to be able to write a message, just like on the previous card. So I didn't want to waste my beautiful pattern paper and decided to save it for another project. Since the front might end up looking a little plain, I thought I'll enhance it a bit with heat embossing. I plan on using a tiny stamp here and there to create a subtle pattern on the front. Then I'll heat emboss the design to add texture. But before I get to that step, I want to die cut the panel and then get to the heat embossing because I only need to add the design to the gatefold flaps and not necessarily the back. Just trying to save some effort and supplies, of course. So I'll first score the card at 2 1/8 inches on both sides since it's a thick paper. So scoring both sides makes folding easier. I'll create the folds and then run it through my die cutting machine, and I'll be right back. Time for heat embossing. Here's a trick for small stamps. If the stamp rocks while pressing down, place another stamp at the bottom to stabilize it. This hack helps get a clean impression. You'll find a great explanation for it in my recent hacks video, which I'll link in the description. I'll heat emboss using Gina K's silver embossing powder. Let me finish both sides and I'll be back. I thought about a different way to hold the card closed. Instead of a ribbon like before, I'll use a vellum belly band. This works perfectly since the card can open in either direction, and it's also going to create a really soft look given the really muted color palette. With that in mind, I cut out a belly band measuring 1 inch by 11 inches. I won't need the entire strip, but we'll get to that in a second. I also cut out the larger layer from a scrap piece of brushed silver cardstock, just another attempt to use scraps here. I chose the sending prayer sentiment here because the card has such a serene vibe to it, and it could work as a sympathy or an encouragement card. I'll adhere everything directly to the card base, so it won't be a problem to get the belly band on. Let's start assembling the centerpiece first. To make sure I get the alignment perfectly on the card base, I'll close the flaps on the gatefold and then place the centerpiece into position with a little temporary glue first. This is a really good technique because using temporary tape or adhesive allows you to move things around before committing with a permanent glue. So I'll press everything down lightly with the temporary adhesive first. Now I'll slide liquid glue under the edges and then test everything with my slide test. Wherever the paper slides in, it needs a little more glue. For creating the belly band, I'll adhere a piece of cardstock to the back because once the card becomes thicker, I'll need to take that added thickness into consideration. Otherwise, the belly band won't fit properly. So I'll cut a 4x4 square from a piece of scrap cardstock, and just to give it a little bit of variety, I'll use a corner rounder to soften the edges. Now I can go ahead and stick it down. I'm ready to make the belly band now. Since gluing vellum can be tricky, I'll squeeze out a tiny bit of glue and apply it with my fingertip. I want to keep this card simple, but the vellum looks a little too plain. So I'll add 3 large silver pearls to the vellum to give it some visual interest without over embellishing, perfect for a sympathy card. Now the card is complete. You can slip the band on and off fairly easily. You cannot really see any glue on the vellum, which is exactly what we want. In the next one, you'll see how to create a shaker window and a frame to go around it using nesting dies. So let's keep going. Nesting dies are really great for shaker windows, and I'll use these to not just create the shaker window, but also create a frame around the shaker as well. It's a great way to make your shaker window look polished. I'm using more leftover pattern paper, and it's funny because I realized I mostly have scraps of holiday patterns. So we are going to have to make a holiday card, but it's not a bad idea to get started already, right? I already cut down the pattern paper to 4 by 5¼ inches, slightly smaller than the card base, so it leaves me a narrow white border around the edges. I also chose a sentiment from my stash and another scrap to create a frame for the shaker window. I have a piece of acetate for behind the shaker window as well. The first step is creating the shaker window. I'll use the smaller die near the top of the card, leaving space for the sentiment across the bottom. Now that I have the window cut out, I can cut out the frame, and I really like the gradient on this piece of paper. Here's a trick for perfectly aligning dies. I use this magnetic fridge calendar I received in the mail. When I try to line up dies on my work surface and make sure the border is even, they keep slipping and shifting out of place. But if I place them on the magnet, they stay put and makes it so much easier to line everything up properly. They'll only move if I move them, and see, the magnet holds the dies down pretty securely. Tweezers help with micro adjustments, and then I use a small piece of tape to hold everything in place. I had used this magnetic sheet in my die cutting machine, so it's become wavy, so I'm having a bit of trouble keeping things level. I need to find myself another magnetic sheet. Once aligned, I can cut out the frame and it will be perfectly symmetrical. I like to use cheap acetate from AliExpress for shaker cards when I don't need to heat emboss. And this looks cloudy because of the protective film on top, but I'll remove the film when I adhere it to the card. I only need a small piece, so I'll mark the size with a Sharpie, then trim it accordingly. I just need my pokey tool to get the protective film off the acetate so I can apply the glue. I still have the film on the other side to minimize my fingerprints on the acetate, but of course I could clean it up with rubbing alcohol, which I'll do later, but I want to make sure it's nicely stuck down first. Now I'll go ahead and remove the film from this side so I can use the foam tape around the edges. I have some narrow foam tape here, and another tip is when you're working with curves, remove the backing paper first. It makes it much easier to mold it around the curves. If you haven't made a shaker card before, basically applying the foam tape around the periphery of the window will keep the shaker bits stay contained within this area. Now I'll take a little rubbing alcohol and a clean tissue and gently clean off any dust or gunk from the acetate, so it looks nice and shiny once it's done. I'll take off a little bit of backing at a time so the foam tape doesn't stick prematurely. Next, we need the shaker bits. I'll roughly place them here. These are just sequins I got from AliExpress. and I think this is more than enough. Now I'll add some more foam tape behind the card front to even out the surface. Ideally, you should use the same height of foam tape to keep an even surface. Different types of foam tapes may not be ideal, but I know from experience the narrow foam strip is the same height as the wider one I'm using here. I'll apply a tiny bit of glue on the foam tape since handling it can make it lose its stickiness, but it will also give me a few seconds in case I need to reposition the panel. Also, the half-removed release papers act like spring, so I can adjust the placement until I'm happy before pressing it down. Next, I'll add the frame I created earlier around the shaker window to give it a polished look. Then the sentiment. It's a little too long, so I'll need to trim the edges. I'll snip them off at an angle, and here's another tip to get the exact same angle on both ends. I'll use my scissors to cut off one end. Then I'll take the trimmed corner and line it up right here to get the perfect angle. And now you can see that I've lined it up, which gives me the exact same angle I have on the other end. And that's perfect. Now I'll adhere it to the card base with some glue and it's done. Simple card and great use of nesting dies to create a shaped window and a frame around it. Keep watching to see how I created the next card in the most straightforward way using nesting dies for layering. This is probably the simplest layering technique using a nesting die. I only used the label dies for this and it looks beautiful. To be honest, the 6x6 pattern paper does most of the work. I use scraps of gold cardstock for the base layer and another scrap for the second layer. Heat embossed the sentiment and added a few gems. These are positively sparkling gems from Salmon Says Stamp, and the sequins are antique gold from Altenew. This is simple but stunning. Probably one of my favorite cards. And last but not least, I made a mini card using the larger of the two label dies to create the shaped card base, and then use patterned paper scraps and the second layering die for the heat embossed Merry Christmas sentiment. I'll make another video on creating shaped cards because this video is already pretty long. For this second one, I cut a piece of brushed rose gold cardstock and used the scrap from the sympathy card. I stamped a cake from an old Salmon Says Stamp set and embossed it in white. On the back, I stamped to and from and added this beautiful blue ribbon from Uniquely Creative. And as you can see, there are so many possibilities with just one set of dies. And if you're looking for more ideas on how to stretch your supplies, I created a video recently where I took one sentiment die set, a couple of additional supplies, and created 5 cards. You can watch that video here.